Okay, let's go ahead and get started with the urinary system lab for this week. And without further ado, let's get rolling. So, starting off with objective 1 on page 64 of your lab manual. Real quick, it goes to page 66 in your lab manual. Alright, so 64 to 66. Nice quick lab for you on the urinary system. But objective 1 is looking at being able to identify the organs of the urinary system. So this one's pretty straightforward. We have the kidneys, which are involved in filtration and absorption of water, as well as other chemicals, and the formation of urine. Then we have the ureters coming down from those, carrying that urine to a storage container in the urinary bladder. And then the urethra stemming from the urinary bladder will exit the body to excrete that urine. All right, so you have those 4 different structures of the urinary system: kidneys to ureter, to urinary bladder, to urethra. Next, we have some structures on models that you could utilize. So I have a link in your Blackboard page in order to find the pictures of the models. So you'll want to be able to identify that this is a kidney. This would be like the adrenal gland. Don't need to be able to identify that, but just know that this isn't necessarily part of the kidney. And then stemming from your kidney would be the ureter down to the urinary bladder. And not very well pictured here would be the urethra coming from the urinary bladder. Objective 2 is to identify different aspects of the kidney. And so right away you can notice this indentation inside the kidney here. And so that's everything entering and leaving the kidney. So you have your artery with carrying blood into the kidney to be filtered, and then filtered blood leaving the kidney via the vein. And then all that filtrate via urine is leaving via the ureter. All right, so blood enters the kidney via the artery, blood leaves the kidney via the vein, and waste products leave the kidney via the ureter. So our clean blood leaves via the renal vein. Our renal capsule is kind of this fatty covering on the outside of the kidney. And so if we ask what the outside layer of the kidney is, we're talking about the renal capsule. If we're talking about this thicker layer in between the renal capsule and the renal medulla here, which we'll get to shortly, we're talking about the cortex. This renal cortex is going to be what contains the glomerulus and the convoluted tubules, which we'll identify here shortly. All right, so that's our renal cortex. So basically, blood is going to enter in this renal artery. It's going to travel past the medulla into the renal cortex and then filter down into these renal pyramids, into the collecting ducts, which we'll get to here shortly, and the calyces, and then leave via the ureter. So objective 2 continued. We're talking about a series of flow here. So we entered via the renal artery, then we went to the cortex, and now that we're in the cortex, we can enter the medulla. And this is where the collecting ducts are going to be. So these the medulla is going to be characterized by these pyramids, these triangle-shaped pyramids. So these are called renal pyramids. And the point at which the pyramid comes to is called the apex. It's just like we have the apex of the lung and the apex of the heart. This would be the apex of the renal pyramid that enters into the calyces. All right, so the renal pyramid is going to be consisting of the renal columns. Oops, sorry. I'm all over the place. The renal pyramid is going to have renal columns in between them. All right, and this is just connective tissue, so there's nothing really physiologically going on here besides connecting these pyramids together. And then the renal pyramids flow into these renal calyces. All right, so a calyx for singular and a calyce for plural. And then we have this renal pelvis. All right, so the renal pelvis is where the urine is going to be flowing into the ureters. So this is our renal pelvis. When it comes down to it, though, you don't need to be able to identify a minor or a major calyx. Just to be able to identify that, oh, we're leaving the medulla or the medullary pyramid, and now we're in a calyx. So renal calyx. And then the renal pelvis is when all of those calyces come together to form a ureter. So you'll want to be able to find all these different structures on a model. So again, find that page in our Blackboard site and be able to identify, oh, number 4, that's the renal pelvis. Oh, number 3, that's a ureter. Oh, number 2, that's a renal artery. Oh, number 7, that's a renal pyramid. oh, no, where this, if I circled this, you could tell me that's a renal column, or I could say A, that's a renal column. All right, this is the cortex. So we could say even number or letter G here would be considered a cortex. All right. So you want to be able to identify all of these. And now we can talk about a nephron, the functional unit of the kidney. So a nephron consists of the starting point for where filtrate occurs in the glomerulus. This glomerulus is encapsulated by a glomerular capsule, or Bowman's capsule. Those two structures together form the renal corpuscle. All right, so it doesn't show it on this slide, but this is the renal corpuscle. This red space in the middle here is the glomerulus. The capsule around it is the glomerular capsule, or Bowman's capsule. That filter, or filtrate, travels through these ducts, or these tubes. All right, the first spot is the proximal convoluted tubule because it's closest to the glomerulus. It then travels down, and this downward spot, you don't need to know ascending or descending, just know that this downward loop to where it's going to end up coming back up is called the loop of Henle, or you can also call it the nephron loop. And then it continues on into a distal tubule, so it's not proximal, it's not close to the glomerulus, now it's distal from it, it's distant, it's further. And then that filtrate follows into the collecting duct. And this collecting duct is going to be consisted in those renal pyramids and flow down, down, down into the renal, the calyx, so the renal calyces, to leave via the renal pelvis and then the ureter. All right, so you want to know the order of these different aspects and be able to identify different spots, like, all right, glomerulus, glomerular capsule, renal corpuscle together, proximal tubule, loop of Henle, distal tubule, collecting duct. All right, you want to be able to identify these. Now we can talk about objective 5 with some histology. So first, this is a picture of the urinary bladder. It's kind of difficult to determine what you're looking at here. Just be able to know that this is the tissue, this is the space. So this is where the urine would be. The space directly forming the lining, or I shouldn't say space, the cells directly forming the lining are called epithelial cells. Just like the digestive system, this is the mucosa. Instead of columnar epithelia in our digestive system, though, this is transitional epithelia. So you want to be able to identify that this is a transitional epithelia making up the mucosal lining of the urinary bladder. And then the inside needs to be able to contract, right? So that's smooth muscle. We have to be able to contract to force that urine out of the body. So this is smooth muscle on the inside. And then we have objective 5 continued here, looking at the histology of a kidney. And so it doesn't really say it in objective 5, but if you look at objective 3 has an asterisk next to the glomerulus and the renal tubule. You need to be able to identify these on a slide. The circles are the big glomeruli. So this is where kind of that capsule would be. And then the glomerulus has all the different capillary cells that we go into detail in lecture talking about that functional transaction between the different units that are moving around in there. But these big circles are those glomeruli. If I ask what these little indentations are, you can think about it as this is a cross section, and coming toward you and away from you from the screen are these big tubes. So you take a section of that and it looks like a tube coming toward you or away from you. And that's what these tubes are. So I could point to any one of these and ask you, what are these? What's this region called? What structure would this be? You just tell me a renal tubule. You don't need to tell me that it's the proximal tubule or the distal or the loop of Henle or a collecting duct even. Just identify that it is a renal tubule. And that actually does it for our lab. There's nothing else after this. It's a really quick one. Again, focus on the models and the slides, be able to identify the order of things, what structures you're looking at, and just make sense of things physiologically, and definitely pertain to your lecture notes to make sure you're understanding everything, because you want to understand the flow of things in order to identify what those structures are. If you have any questions, please reach out via email. Otherwise, we'll chat soon.